Welcome to BGN Action News. My name is Hector Ramirez. We interrupt your regularly scheduled program with this exclusive breaking news. Cobra forces have taken over the North Pole using a device previously thought impossible, the Weather Dominator Mark II. And we've just been informed that Admiral Keel and Snowjob are leading the G.I. Joe forces as they face off against Cobra Commander and Destro in the battle for the Arctic Circle. Seeing as I've actually spent time with all of these leaders, I might be able to arrange for interviews with each of them, but while someone else is working that out, let's take a look at how this battle for control of the world's weather is going to play out. It appears that the powers on both sides have agreed to use something called Axis and Allies mechanics. No, Ted, I don't know what that is. Do you? Well, we'll find someone that does. While my team is working on that, how about a word from our sponsor?
BGN Action News is made possible by Renegade Game Studios. Renegade's unique approach breathes new life into classic games, revives previously hard-to-find gems, and creates all kinds of new tabletop adventures for Axis and Allies, Heroescape, My Little Pony, Transformers, Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and so much more. Follow the link in the description to find your next adventure. Back to you in the studio, Hector. Hector?
Right. It looks like Renegade has created a board game to help the Joes find the best way to overcome this new Cobra threat. It allows players to set up the battle now raging in the Arctic on their tables at home. It's called G.I. Joe Battle for the Arctic Circle, and it's powered by Axis and Allies. Time to tell you about the Axis and Allies mechanics at the core of this battle. Of course, I've known all about these for years. Still, since he's already here, let's introduce the 2023 Axis and Allies World Champion, Mr. Gary Blevins.
Hello?
Yes, hello. This is Hector Ramirez with BGN Action News.
I'm sorry, who?
I understand that you have some experience with Axis and Allies. What do you think about what's happening in the battle for the Arctic Circle?
Oh, yeah, I actually just got a copy of the game from Renegade, and it looks like a lot of fun.
Fun isn't really a word I would use to describe it, but can you explain to our viewers how the folks at home can help use this game to help the Joes' forces determine the very fate of the world?
So you want to know how to play?
Sure.
All right, let's make it hot.
What?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's normally I just said let's make it hot, and then and there's a thing, and it's never mind. Oh, there it is. The game comes with a great rule book, but for the purposes of teaching, I'm probably going to jump around a little bit. Maybe that crack BGN News graphics team can add a pop-up with the relevant page numbers as I go. Nice. Let's start with the basics. G.I. Joe, the Battle for the Arctic Circle, is designed for 2 to 4 players ages 14 and up, and is estimated to take about 90 minutes to play a full game. Players are asked to take on the role of one or more of the commanders currently battling for control over the Arctic Circle. If you'd like a closer look at what comes inside the box, we actually made an unboxing video for this game. You can follow the link right here to see that. When learning any game, I like to start by understanding the board. The top left of the board has the mobilization zone. Units purchased at the beginning of a commander's turn will hang out there until they join the action near the end of the turn. In the top right, we have a round counter. In the bottom right corner, we find the turn order as well as the colors for each power. Cobra Commander and Destro are represented by red and black, and they are Team Cobra. Admiral Keel and Snowjob are blue and white, and they are Team G.I. Joe. Next to the turn order list is the Strategic Reserve. Here, each power can track any saved resources. In the bottom left corner, we'll find the Victory Point Tracker. The battlefield itself is a hex map that includes 6 bases outlined in the colors of the 4 powers. Each power controls one of the bases alone, and 2 of the bases are shared by the respective teams. This game includes 3 different scenarios that can be played, but in all of them, if a power captures any of the enemy bases, it is an instant win. So both teams will need to defend these carefully.
So all the Joes have to do is defend their bases, grab one of the Cobras, and they win. Easy.
Well, I don't know how easy it'll be. Also, that isn't the only way to win. The scenario that we're going to focus on today is scenario number 1, the cold open. Here, players can also declare victory if their team ends a round holding a certain number of victory points.
Oh, what is a victory point?
On the map, you'll notice some of the hexes have white numbers in them. These hexes start as neutral, but have been improved in some way and have a greater value. If a team ends a round controlling a combined total of 10 or more victory points, they win.
Oh, you said victory point. Yes, of course. Yes, yes, definitely. Very important.
Uh-huh. Those white numbers are also used for another very important purpose that we'll talk about in just a minute. We finish up our tour of the map by heading back to the top right corner and that round tracker. In our scenario, if neither team is controlling 10 victory points by the end of the 7th round, the power with the most victory points wins.
So, in scenario 1, a team can win by capturing an enemy base, being the first team to be holding 10 or more victory points at the end of a round, or by having the most victory points at the end of round 7?
Exactly. Now you're getting it. Before we get the game set up, a few last notes about the map. All of the hexes on this map are one of 3 types: sea only, land only, or land and sea hexes. Land and sea hexes can also be called mixed hexes or dual hexes. Sea units can move through sea only and dual hexes. Likewise, land units can move through land only and dual hexes. More detail about the movement of land and sea units through dual hexes later, but those are the basics for now. Air units can move through any hex type, even if those hexes have enemy units or markers in them. However, air units must have a safe place to land at the end of their turn. Oh, and lots of the sea-only and the mixed hexes have these little white spots in them. These are icebergs and they're just decorative. They don't affect the gameplay at all. This battle is only happening in the Arctic, so this map doesn't wrap around. Lastly, the only hexes that can be truly controlled by one side or the other are the improved hexes. Those are the bases or the victory point hexes. Otherwise, any hex with enemy units in it is hostile, and any unimproved hex with no enemy units or previously unoccupied victory hexes are neutral. Time to get this game ready for action. Place the board in the center of the table and put the round tracking token in the 1 position on the round tracker on the board. Give each player their commander boards and all of the units of their matching color, as well as the control markers. But remember, these control markers are double-sided, so they'll need to be in reach of both members of that team. Team Cobra will also need to have the Weather Dominator token and the ice hexes readily available to them. The player aids, the combat dice, and the gray and green stacking chips should be accessible to all the players. Oh, real quick. The stacking chips are used to help make it easy to quickly see what's happening on the map. So a mini on the map is just 1 unit. Each gray chip under that mini represents 1 additional unit of the same type. A green chip is worth 3 additional units of that type. So a guy with a gray chip is 2 guys. A guy with a green chip under it equals 4 guys. You get it. Oh, and you are definitely going to want to use these chips during the game because the number of stacks of units is limited by the number of minis that come with the game. So the game includes 2 aircraft carriers for each power. That means that while you can have as many chips under a carrier as you want, each carrier can only have stacks of them in no more than 2 hexes. That also means that if you don't have enough actual pieces to make a move, it can't be made. So if you've got 2 stacks of carriers on the map, they're not allowed to break up in a way that would require the use of a 3rd mini. Something to keep in mind, especially when you're purchasing new units. Before setting up the pieces on the board, players will need to select a scenario, as each scenario has a different setup. As we mentioned, Scenario 1 is called the Cold Open and is the best for new players, so that's what we'll be focusing on today. For the details and the setup for the Cold Open, we turn to pages 20 and 21 in the rulebook and note where the units are printed on the map. Place the same units in the corresponding hexes on the board. For example, Snowjob's base, near the upper left of the map and bordered in white, has silhouettes for a Snowstriker, a Cruiser, a Snowcat vehicle with 2 gray chips, representing 3 units, and an Arctic Trooper with a green chip, representing a total of 4 troopers. Place Snowjob's units in the base hex. Rinse and repeat for all the other hexes until the board state matches the map on pages 20 and 21 in the rulebook. As you go through this, look closely for any gray and green chips under those silhouettes in the rulebook. They can be a little easy to miss. With each player placing their own units, it should only take a minute or 2 to go from this to this.
Ooh, very nice.
Right? People love that. Even if there are fewer than 4 players in your game, the units for all the commanders should still be in play, and each of the powers will take their turn in order. Each player can play more than 1 power if needed, but of course they should only play powers of the same side. Pages 22 through 25 in the rulebook talk about scenarios 2 and 3. Scenario 2 is called a hot start and is very similar to the cold start, except, well, it's hot. The units start closer together and combat fires up right away. Scenario 3 is a capture the flag style setup. All 3 scenarios are different, but each is a lot of fun in their own way. If you want to learn more about those, you can find them in the rulebook. Now that we've set up the game and we know our objectives, let's break down the gameplay for G.I. Joe Battle for the Arctic Circle. Each commander will have a turn in the order shown in the bottom right of the map. Cobra Commander goes first, then Admiral Keel, then Destro, and Snowjob goes last. The end of Snowjob's turn marks the end of a round, and there will never be more than 7 rounds in any game. So get in there and fire it up. Each commander's turn is broken into 7 phases. The first is purchase reinforcements. Here, players will use the in-game currency called reinforcement points to purchase new units and place them in the mobilization zone. Then, in the combat move phase, players will announce their attacks and move their units into enemy-controlled hexes. In the conduct combat phase, we separate the mice from the men and resolve all the battles. When completed, the non-combat move phase begins. In this phase, players must move units that are violating the stacking limits of a hex, land surviving air units, and then they may move any of their units that did not make a combat move. In the check stacking limits phase, players double check that they haven't exceeded the unit limit of any of the hexes and remove any violators. By the way, the max is 12 total units in bases and 8 total units anywhere else. At this point, players will move the units they purchased at the beginning of their turn from the mobilization zone and onto the battlefield in one or both of their bases. But the placement of any incoming units must respect the stacking limits of the base hex. Players will then total the victory point hexes that they control and make sure that they're recorded correctly on the victory point chart. Once that's done, play passes to the next player in order. I know that might seem like a lot right now, but it really does flow pretty smoothly. Yeah, when I spent time hanging out with Cobra and Destro, I got a close-up look at all of that. Oh, is that when they kidnapped you? Me? Kidnapped? No. That was investigative journalism. I wanted to see what they were up to. Still, maybe you should walk through these phases for the folks at home. Good idea. Each power starts their turn off with the purchase reinforcements phase. Here, players add up all of the numbers that are on the improved hexes that commander controls. That's all their VP hexes and both bases. This total is their available reinforcement points. Then they spend those reinforcement points, or RPs for short, on any units that they want to buy in that round. Those shiny new units will hang out in the mobilization zone until they're deployed later in the turn. Commanders may choose to save up to 4 reinforcement points for future rounds. If they do, they'll place a control marker on the strategic reserve chart with the number of points that they've saved. Any RPs beyond those 4 in the strategic reserve are lost. So, go nuts. Also, remember, reinforcement points can't be given, loaned, or transferred to any other power for any reason. Both of the powers on Team Cobra have an additional option during the purchase reinforcements phase. On each of their turns during this phase, Cobra and Destro can use the Weather Dominator. Do you have to say it like that? Yes. During the purchase reinforcements phase, the Team Cobra player may spend 1 reinforcement point to freeze a sea or dual hex, turning it into a land-only hex. The target hex cannot contain units of any kind, be a base or be a victory point hex. When the Weather Dominator freezes a hex, place an ice hex token on the frozen location. Now, land units are able to move onto, into, or through that ice hex for movement purposes, but sea units can no longer enter. Now, cruisers have an Icebreaker ability that can destroy those ice hexes during combat, but more about that later. Time for combat. Here, following the particular movement rules of each unit type, players may choose to make any, all, or none of these 3 types of combat moves with their land and sea units in any order that they would like. 1. Commanders can move land or sea units into a hex with enemy units. 2. They can move into an unoccupied improved hex that is enemy controlled. Or 3. Players can use the Icebreaker ability of a cruiser to attack an ice hex. If the move of a land or sea unit isn't doing one of those 3 things, it has to wait until the non-combat move phase. Entering a hex with an enemy unit in it ends the movement of all land or sea units for the rest of the turn. Remember, any sea or land units that make a combat move won't be making any voluntary moves during the non-combat phase. Now's a good time to clarify that movement rule that's specific to dual hexes. While this rule is logical, I found that sometimes it requires a second look. Land and sea units can move from dual hex to dual hex, but each must have an appropriate path. For a land unit to move out of a dual hex, there must be a land bridge connecting it to that adjacent hex. Land must actually be crossing the line that separates the hexes. So you can see here that these are both dual hexes, but you can't just walk across the water from Greenland south to Iceland. Wait, what? Yeah, that's Greenland and that's Iceland. Do you see it now? Oh. It took me a second too. Oh, and before my fellow geography nerds jump in here, I know that everything that points away from the North Pole is south. Still, for the purposes of explaining this game, I'm going to call the top of the map north and follow the compass rose around, so northeast, southwest, etc. Yeah, some people. Am I right? Sure. Now, once a land unit has made it into a hex, it occupies the entire hex, so it can ignore any waterways that might exist inside of the same dual hex, and use any available land bridge in that hex to leave it. Of course, sea units are just the opposite. They need a clear waterway to cross into or out of a dual hex. Here we can see that a sea unit could move along the coast to that victory point hex, but it couldn't move across the land and into the hex to the north. Like in this case, normally it's pretty easy to make out. Still, to avoid any confusion, I've made versions of the map with arrows and X's denoting what is passable for land units, and another map to show what's passable for sea units. You can find them at BoardGameNation.com and just click on the Community tab.
You just want people to go to your YouTube channel and subscribe. You probably also want them to like this video. Typical YouTuber.
Actually, this is just the easiest place I could think of for people to find these free resources, but yeah, that'd be great too. Thanks for reminding everyone. I'll tell you what, I'll also put them up on the Board Game Nation Facebook page.
That is not...
Anyway, moving on. This game has two types of sea units, cruisers and aircraft carriers, and they have the same ability regardless of who the controlling commander is. Aircraft carriers are pretty straightforward. They can hold up to 2 air units of the same color on their flight decks. They can also absorb the first hit assigned to them in any given battle without losing any abilities. If they take 1 hit during a battle, tip it on its side, like so, to denote the damage. If it takes a second hit before the battle resolves, it is destroyed. If a damaged carrier survives the rest of the battle, and with the speed that you could only find on television, the carrier is automatically repaired. Turn it right side up and carry on. Magic.
Hey now, these are highly trained personnel with years of combat experience.
Uh-huh. Your mustache is crooked.
What? Well, I never...
Cruisers also have 2 abilities that are critical to the war effort. First, and most importantly, they can transport any 2 land units of the same color across sea and mixed hexes. A few really important things to keep in mind here. To accomplish this, the cruiser needs to be in the same dual hex as the land units they wish to load. They can pick up units along the way in other dual hexes, but they can only unload in another dual hex, and they can only do that once per turn. To offload, cruisers actually enter the dual hex with the land units. Cruisers can't offload from a sea-only hex, and of course they can't enter a land-only hex. Again, dual hexes are the only loading and unloading hexes for cruisers. While land units can be transported on a cruiser as a combat or a non-combat move, land units cannot move before being loaded or after offloading. A player may end their turn with land units on board a cruiser if it ends the non-combat phase in a sea-only hex. If the cruiser ends in a dual hex, the land units are automatically offloaded at the end of the turn. On later turns, they can get on that cruiser again and move as normal. 3 really important things to keep in mind here. First, when at sea, land units on cruisers are just cargo. They don't fire or get fired at. They're just along for the ride. Second, if a defending cruiser is destroyed in a sea-only hex while carrying land units, the land units are also destroyed. So, choose wisely. Lastly, if a cruiser is in a dual hex with land units and the cruiser is destroyed, it does not mean that the land units are also destroyed. Remember, in dual hexes, the land units are automatically offloaded. So while the sinking of a cruiser in a dual hex with land units in it would be sad for those land units to watch, they're definitely going to be there to try to avenge it later. Again, land units can move on cruisers as part of a combat or non-combat move. However, if a land unit is transported into combat by a cruiser, that entire battle is now an amphibious assault, and there will be no retreat for any of the attacking units in that hex. Land units attacking from a cruiser make the entire combat now do or die for all attacking land, sea, and air units. That is a big difference for my experienced Axis and Allies players out there. Here's another one. Cruisers and carriers can move into dual hexes and do combat with all of the enemy units in that hex, regardless of whether or not they're transporting land units. So a cruiser can carry up to 2 land units into a dual hex that's hostile, offload those units, and then fight right beside them against the enemy units there. No more sitting offshore and firing from a distance. They are right in the action round after round after round. They can hit and be hit by any enemy unit in that hex, including land units. Carriers can also move into dual hexes to be part of an attack, absorb a hit, and still be there to catch any fighters that might need a place to land. So I like it. Still, as cool as all that is, sea units alone can never capture a victory point hex or a base. It always takes a land unit to raise the flag.
Okay, You said that the cruisers have two abilities. The first is transporting the land units, and that makes sense. Now tell us about the second one.
Ah, right. All cruisers also have the ability to act as icebreakers. However, the Icebreaker Ability involves a few things that we haven't covered yet, so we're going to double back to that one. To give you an overall feel for how combat works, let's jump right into an example that uses the first two types of combat moves that we mentioned earlier. Now this example is the core mechanic for most Axis and Allies games. We're going to come back and add in air units and the various special abilities later. Let's get the basics first.
Hey, that's Greenland.
Well spotted. Cobra Commander has taken over these 3 victory point hexes. It's Admiral Keel Hall's turn, and he's looking to clean house. It's time for his combat move. Cobra Commander has 3 Serpents standing guard in one of the VP hexes, but the others have no enemy units in them, but are Cobra controlled. The Admiral has 1 Arctic Trooper in the dual hex to the south, and 2 more in the hex to the southwest. He also has a cruiser and a trooper in his base, and another cruiser and 2 more guys just outside the Apache base. The Admiral wants to take over all 3 victory point hexes, so as his combat move, he declares 3 attacks. The first is just 1 trooper walking into the unoccupied VP hex. The second attack, the trooper rides on the cruiser over to the 2-point victory hex. Neither of those first 2 attacks are going to end in combat, but we wait to switch out any control markers until the conduct combat phase. The third attack will actually have some combat. The 2 troopers in the adjacent hexes move into the hex with the Serpent and are joined by the cruiser and 2 more troopers from the south. Remember, because this attack has a cruiser bringing land units to the fight, Keel Hall will not have an option to retreat. So the battle will be 4 Arctic troopers and a cruiser versus 3 Snow Serpents, and it will be do or die. With all of his combat moves set, the Admiral moves into conduct combat. Because these battles don't require any combat, he can declare those a victory and switch out the Cobra control markers for his own and adjust the victory point chart. Next, it's time to start the combat sequence. The combat sequence is broken into 5 easy steps, and step 1 involves a unit that we don't have in this battle, so we can skip that one for now. In step 2, the attackers fire. The attackers will roll 1 die for each attacking unit and will score hits if their roll is equal to or less than the attack value of that unit. The player aid tells us that the Arctic Troopers only have an attack value of 1, meaning that they will only score a hit on the roll of a 1. Keel Hall rolls 4 dice looking for those aces and gets a hit. We see that the cruiser has an attack value of 3, so it will get a hit on a roll of a 3, a 2, or a 1. He rolls and a miss. Now, Cobra Commander has to assign one of those hits to his units. In this case, he has to choose one of his Serpents. He moves it back to show the hit, but it will get to fire back. In step 3, the defenders fire. They'll score a hit for every roll that is equal to or less than the defense value of their units. Again, referring to the player aid, we see that Snow Serpents have a defense value of 2. So they'll roll 3 dice looking for 2s and 1s and 1 hit. The Admiral now has to assign that hit. He could select the cruiser, but one of the troopers is the better choice, so he removes 1 from play. In step 4, that defending Serpent that took the hit before is now removed. In step 5, we would normally offer the attackers a choice here. They could continue the attack and start another round of combat, or they could retreat. If they retreat, combat ends and all of the attacking land and sea units must move back to an adjacent hex where at least one of the attacking sea or land units came from. If all of the attacking land or sea units can't go back to the same hex because of terrain restrictions, they can go to 2 hexes. However, in our case, the Admiral can't retreat because of the Amphibious Assault rule. Plus, he's no quitter. So, combat starts again. We return to step 2. Now with 3 remaining troopers, the Admiral rolls 3 dice looking for 1s and nothing. The cruiser fires looking for a 3 or less and a hit. Cobra Commander moves back one of its Serpents. Step 3, Cobra Commander fires back with 2 dice hoping for a 2 or less and, 2 hits. The Admiral removes 2 troopers. Step 4, that fallen Serpent is now removed. Step 5, again, retreat is not an option here, so back to step 2. The trooper fires needing a 1 and a miss. The cruiser fires needing a 3 or less and a hit. The Serpent moves back but gets to return fire in step 3. He needs a 2 or less and a hit. The Admiral now has to make a tough choice. Only land units can capture a VP hex, but the cruiser is the more expensive unit. He decides that the VP hex is the priority, so he decides to assign that last hit to the cruiser. It's removed from play. Step 4, that last Serpent is also removed. Now, in step 5, with no more enemy units present, the Admiral can remove the Cobra marker and with his last land unit, raise his flag. A successful round of combat for the Admiral, but Cobra Commander definitely made him pay for it.
Well, that makes sense, but where are the air units?
Good call. Now that you've got the basics for combat, let's talk about air units, how they work, and how they might turn the tide in this battle. Each side has their own type of air unit. The Joe's air units are called Skystrikers, and the Cobras are called Rattlers. They've got a couple of differences, but let's start with what they have in common. In most instances, air units split their movement between the combat and non-combat move phases. They use some of their movement points to get to a fight, and then some to find a place to land. Both air units have the ability to fly over enemy units, control markers, and bases during combat and non-combat move phases without needing to engage the units that are in them. Still, combat moves by air units must end in a hex with enemy units, and every attacking air unit must have a plan to land safely in the non-combat move phase that is at least theoretically possible. No kamikazes in this game. Aircraft carriers can always provide a safe landing zone for up to 2 air units of the same color when occupying the same dual or see-only hex. All air units can also land in improved hexes that were not under enemy control at the beginning of the turn, but they can never take control of a hex. Again, only land units can raise a flag. If through the course of combat a safe landing zone is not available in the non-combat phase, usually caused by a carrier being destroyed during combat, the air units crash and are destroyed at the end of the non-combat phase. An important note here, air units on aircraft carriers move independently from the carriers. Air units count their movement from the hex they start the turn in, regardless of what action the carrier might take. So, in short, you can't move the carrier and then launch the fighters. Also, the rules for retreating are a bit different for air units. If a battle involves attacking air units and the attacking player decides to retreat, the combat ends, but instead of heading to an adjacent hex like land or sea units do, units stay in the hex and move during the non-combat move phase using any remaining movement points to find a safe place to land. Air units can never end a turn in a hex with enemy units or markers.
When I was with Cobra Commander and Destro last, I discovered that the Cobra's Rattlers can land almost anywhere.
That's true. Did you discover that when you were not kidnapped the second time?
Maybe.
Well, Rattlers have an attack value of 3, a defense value of 4, and a movement value of 3, but most importantly, they have an ability called VTOL, short for vertical takeoff and landing. This allows Rattlers to land in any land or dual hex, including VP hexes that have been captured this turn. So, they can land on a carrier of their own color, in a friendly or previously uncontrolled VP hex or base, and they can land in any regular land or dual hex. Talk about options. Now, the big trade-off is that they only have 3 movement points compared to the Skystrikers' 4. Speaking of Skystrikers, these are the baddest birds in the air. With an attack value of 4, a defense value of 4, and a movement value of 4, they move fast and hit hard. However, their advanced systems mean that they require a bit more maintenance. Skystrikers may only land on friendly bases, on aircraft carriers of their color, or on VP hexes that were not under enemy control at the start of the turn. This means Skystrikers can never land in a hex where they just defeated enemy units, unless an aircraft carrier of their color is there to catch them in the non-combat phase, and they can never land on an unimproved hex. Let's back up and look at another example of a combat move and combat sequence. This time, we'll add in some air units and more sea units. This example should also give some additional clarity around the rules for aircraft carriers. Let's take a look. This time, it's Cobra Commander's turn, and he's got some juicy targets. He's declaring 3 attacks. He'd like to go after that 1 VP hex on the northwest tip of Greenland, but it's not a dual hex, so the cruiser can't enter it. Instead, he attacks the 1 VP hex on the northeastern tip of Greenland. For his second attack, he sends 2 cruisers, each with 2 serpents, to attack the 2 VP island. To make it easier to see, I switched out some of the attacking units' miniatures for chips here. The Joes have a pretty good defense there, so Cobra Commander decides to send in some additional air support. He sends the 2 Rattlers south from the North Pole base, and 2 more Rattlers from the 1 VP hex to the east. He's still a little nervous about it, so he decides to also launch the Rattler from the carrier. It will fly over the hex with Keel's carrier and the Skystrikers and engage the mixed units with the rest of the commander's units. Quite a party there on that little island. However, notice that this is now an Amphibious Assault, so it will be do or die for all of the attacking units. For his third attack, he's eyeing that sea-only hex with the USS Flag in it. He chooses to attack it with the 2 remaining cruisers and the Rattler from his base. He's also going to be a little sneaky here. The carrier can move up to 2 hexes to get to the fight, so he moves south to the 1 VP hex first and then enters the combat from the southeast. If the battle goes badly, this will give the Cobra Commander another possible hex to retreat to. Now, before we can move on to conduct combat, we have to make sure that all of the attacking air units have a possible place to land. It just so happens that all of the Rattlers have used 2 movement points to get to their respective battles, so they all have 1 move left. Rattlers have that whole vertical landing thing, meaning they can land in any unimproved hex or dual hex or in a VP hex that was captured this turn. So all of the Rattlers that are attacking the Joes on the island might be able to land in that hex, assuming that they eliminate all of the enemy units there and that they don't go over the 8-unit max for that hex. Or they can move to the northwest and land in the VP hex that the other battle is about to capture. Or they can move to the north and land in that empty dual hex. Or, and this one's a little sneaky, up to 2 of the air units could make this move assuming that the carrier in the battle to the northeast is going to be successful and that the carrier will be there to catch them. The Rattler attacking the USS Flag has loads of options for landing zones. It can land in the unimproved hexes to the northwest or to the north. It can land in the 1 VP hex that Cobra controlled at the start of the turn to the southwest. If the battle is successful and there's space, it could also move to the 2 VP hex island and join that craziness. Or it can assume that the carrier in the current hex will survive, and if it does, it can stay right where it is. A quick note here about the planned paths laid out for air units during the combat move phase. Someone very smart long ago once said that no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. Such is the case here. Players are not bound to any particular paths for their air units when or if they make it to the non-combat move phase. They just have to show that they had a theoretical place to land for all of their air units when they were launched. Now, no matter what happens during the combat move phase, every attacking unit that can be provided a safe place to land during the non-combat move phase must be, even if it puts the player in a bad position. Players can never intentionally allow an air unit to crash. Okay, back to the battle. Time to conduct combat. These attacks can be resolved in any order that the attacker pleases, but let's start with the easy one. The cruiser carrying a Serpent moves into the dual hex without any opposition and claims the hex. We change out the control marker and lower the VP count for Keel Haul on the chart. Next, let's do that sea battle. Still skipping step 1 for now. Step 2, the carrier has an attack value of 1, so we roll for that one first. He needs a 1 and no luck. The cruiser and the Rattler all hit on a 3 or less and they can all be rolled at the same time. Only 1 hit. Not great for the commander. Keel Haul assigns the hit to the carrier and prepares to fire back. Step 3. The carrier has a defense value of 3. It rolls and misses. The Skystrikers each have a defense value of 4. They roll and 1 hit. There must be some rough seas out there. The commander also assigns that lone hit to his carrier. Step 4, there's nothing to remove. Step 5, press the attack or retreat. Cobra commander decides to press the attack. We go back to step 2. The Cobra carrier fires and misses. The 2 cruisers and the Rattler at a 3 or less, 1 hit. Keel Haul assigns the 1 hit to the carrier, and with that second hit, it is destroyed, but it will get to fire back. Step 3, the sinking carrier fires and a hit. Now the Skystrikers, needing a 4 or less, both misses. Oof, tough day for the Joes. Cobra assigns that lone hit to a cruiser. Step 4, the USS Flag and the attacking cruiser are removed. Step 5, press the attack or retreat. Cobra commander decides to retreat. All of the sea units must now retreat to a hex where at least one of the attacking sea units came from. So because the carrier entered from the southwest, the surviving cruiser and that damaged carrier can head that way. Now that Cobra's carrier has survived the battle, it's immediately repaired. We turn it right side up and it's ready for action. Even though Cobra commander retreated, the Rattler stays in the attack hex and will use its 1 remaining move during non-combat.
Wait, what happens to those Skystrikers now that their carrier is destroyed?
Ooh, that is a good question. You should be a journalist. If that battle had continued, the defending air units would continue to defend the hex. But with the conflict over, this is now a matter that resolves in the non-combat move phase. For this last battle, we're going to fast forward a bit. Suffice it to say that the Joes fought valiantly, but were overrun by Cobra's forces. After all the fighting, the commander had 1 land unit left over to take control. So we change out the control marker and again reduce Keel Haul's score on the victory chart. One thing to note in that last battle. Notice that the defending units consisted of units belonging to both G.I. Joe commanders. In that case, the players controlling the various defending units must agree where to assign any incoming hits. If they can't agree, the attacker chooses, so act accordingly. Now that all of the battles have been resolved, the non-combat move phase begins. A number of critical things happen in this phase. First, and this doesn't happen often, but it does happen, any defending air units that were on carriers that were destroyed must try to find a place to land. They can move up to 2 spaces to find a legal place to land, and they must respect the stacking limits of those hexes. Going back to our example, the 2 Skystrikers have up to 2 hexes to find a place to land. The only eligible space is in Keel Haul's base, and it already has 11 units in it, so only one of the Skystrikers can land there. With no eligible place to land, the other one is destroyed. Next, the active player must move units that are violating the stacking limits of a hex, and they must land surviving air units. These 2 things can happen in whichever order the active player prefers. Let's look at each of them more closely, starting with landing air units that survived combat. Back to our example. The 5 Rattlers that survived their assault on the 2 VP Hex all have 1 move remaining. Because they've got that whole vertical landing ability thing, they can use it to land in any adjacent unimproved hex. The newly captured 1 VP Hex on Greenland, or they can land in the hex that was just captured. As if to show off the power of that vertical takeoff ability, note that a Skystriker wouldn't be able to land in any of those hexes I just mentioned. To land, Skystrikers need a carrier or a friendly or neutral VP Hex or a base. Now let's take a look at this forced move out of an overcrowded hex. If a player attacked a hex with tons of units in one, they might be way over the max of 8 units in a non-base hex. Here you can see Destro has 20 units in this hex after taking out that lone trooper. At this point, the attacking player must remedy this by moving units out. The units that are moving out are at the discretion of the attacking player. They can start by moving out air units that survived the attack to safe landing zones using their remaining movement. If an overage still exists, as it does here, the attacking player must select land and or sea units to move out of the overcrowded hex and into any adjacent hex where the land or sea units entered the attacked hex from. They don't all have to go to the same hex, but they do have to go to an adjacent legal hex where attackers came from. They can't use this forced move to advance into a new hex. Also, once the hex limit is no longer being violated, the rest of the units must stay. They can't just move everyone out. There may be situations where the attacker can't make the forced move without violating the max of the adjacent hex, or because the adjacent hex is impassable to that unit type. In that case, any units that can't move stay in the attacked hex and wait for the bad news. Once this forced move is resolved as best as possible and any air units that survive combat have landed, players may move any units that were not involved in combat. Land and sea units can use their available movement points to reposition themselves for the next round, but they cannot enter or move through any hexes with enemy units or control markers. However, in an odd quirk of the rules, a land unit moving by land or via cruiser can move into or through a victory point hex that is previously uncontrolled, and if it ends its turn there, it can actually take control of it. Now this feels like a combat move, but because the hex isn't enemy controlled and there are no enemy units there to fight, it's technically a non-combat move. Once all the non-combat moves are locked in, the rest is a breeze. Players move on to Phase 5 and double check that none of the hexes that have units exceed the max number for that hex. Again, the max is 12 for bases and 8 units every place else. And remember, players have to account for all of the units in the hex, including units that might be on a carrier or on a cruiser or belong to a teammate. If any hex is found to be over the limit, the active player must remove units of their color from play in that hex until the limit is met. Time to roll out the shiny new units that we purchased at the start of the turn. Players may only place units into either of the bases that they control. However, they may not deploy units into a base if it violates the stacking limit of 12 units in that base or it exceeds the number of miniature pieces that are available. If it happens that a unit cannot be placed due to either of those limits, the extra units are returned to the mobilization zone and that player may attempt to deploy them on future turns. In Phase 7, players add up the values of all the victory point hexes that they control, do not include bases in this total, and adjust the control marker to reflect that total. The end of Snowjob's turn always marks the end of a complete round of play, and it's time to check for victory. In Scenario 1, if either side controls hexes with a combined total victory point value of 10 or more, they're declared the winner. So if Cobra Commander has 6 and Destro has 4 at the end of Snowjob's turn, that's the game. Or if Admiral Keel has 5 and Snowjob has 5, the Joe forces are now victorious. If neither side are holding 10 victory points at the end of the round, advance the round marker and the battle continues with Cobra Commander. If this is the end of the 7th round, the forces are exhausted and the side holding the most victory points wins.
Hold on a minute, mister. What about the vehicles and the other special abilities? And why is there a Step 1?
Ooh, you're right, Harold. There are a number of very cool abilities still to cover. I just want to make sure that you and your viewers had a good understanding of the basics before we got into the plot twists. You ready for more?
First off, my name is...
Good, glad to hear it. This game features 2 ground vehicles, one for each side. They share an ability and each has an ability of their own. The Joes have the Snowcat and Cobra has the more elaborately named Winter Operational Light Fighting Vehicle, or W.O.L.F for short. Both units cost 5, have an attack value of 3, a defense value of 2, and maybe most importantly, a movement value of 2. The extra movement value creates the ability that they share. It's called Blitz or Blitzing. This ability allows them to use their first move to enter and take control of an unoccupied victory point hex, place or change out a control marker, adjust the VP chart, and then continue into a second hex. The second hex can have enemy units in it, and then that move would result in combat. The second hex could also just be another unoccupied victory point hex, and it could end its movement there and claim that one as well. Or the second hex could just be back to where it came from. It's a very handy ability. Their unique abilities are a bit different than some that we've talked about before. The abilities of the Snowcat and the W.O.L.F are only active on the very first round of combat in a battle, but they can both be used on the attack or the defense. Let's start with the Snowcat. The Snowcat has an ability called Wire-Guided Missiles. If the Snowcat hits in its very first round of combat, its controller will be able to assign that hit to an enemy air or land unit of their choosing rather than their opponent. It can be a very big deal. Again, this only triggers the very first time that it rolls a combat die in a battle. Next, we have the W.O.L.F. This one's interesting to me because this ability kind of plays into the pack mentality. This guy's ability is called Ski Torpedoes, and it's a kind of first strike weapon. This ability is the only reason that Step 1 of the combat sequence exists. In Step 1 of the very first round of combat of a battle, the commander attacking or defending with one or more wolves must make a choice to either use the Ski Torpedo ability or not. If they choose not to use it, play continues as normal. If they choose to activate this ability, all of the wolves involved in the battle get a -1 to the appropriate value and fire in Step 1 rather than in Step 2 or 3. Any hits from those wolves are assigned by the opponent, but this is a first strike weapon, so any units destroyed by those hits are immediately removed from the battle and will not be allowed to fire as attackers or as defenders.
Okay, I think I've got it.
Would an example help?
Yeah, that would be great.
You bet. You bet. Sure. Here it's Destro's turn, and we've got a mix of units in the area. Earlier in the game, the Joes claimed the 1 VP hex in the Bering Strait, but it's unoccupied now, and that creates an opening for Destro. He moves the 2 Snow Serpents and one of the wolves from the coast to the northwest. The other wolf blitzes into Joe's VP hex, captures it, changes the marker, reduces the victory point count, and then moves into the fight inland. The Rattler on the carrier wants to get in on the attack, so it uses 2 of its 3 moves and flies over Snowjob's base to get to that fight. That's all the combat moves, but notice that angry stack of wolves and the dual hex on the Russian side of the Bering Strait. They'd love to get into this fight, but as you can see, there are no land bridges there that would allow them to cross into Alaska. They'll need a cruiser to come by to give them a lift. Okay, to the battle. Snowjob has 3 Arctic Troopers and 2 Snowcats versus 2 Serpents and 2 Wolves and a Rattler. Let's start the combat sequence. We have wolves here, so we start with Step 1. Destro decides to use the Ski Torpedo to try to thin down Joe's forces. Normally, on the attack, wolves attack at a 3 or less, but this ability reduces that number to 2 or less. Destro rolls 2 dice looking for deuces and gets 1 hit. The Joes must now assign that hit. They assign it to one of the troopers. That destroys it, so it's removed from play and won't be firing at anyone. On Step 2, the rest of Destro's units now fire away. So he rolls 2 dice for the Serpents needing 1s and no luck. The Rattler needs a 3 or less and a hit. The Joes assign the hit to a trooper and prepare to return fire in Step 3. Now the Joes have 2 troopers and 2 Snowcats ready to blast away. They all score hits on 2 or less, but the Snowcat's ability makes any hits that they score special, so they'll need to be rolled separately. The troopers roll needing a 2 or less, 1 hit. The Snowcats roll using their wire-guided missiles and score 1 hit. Now the Joes get to assign the hit from the Snowcat to any opposing land or air units. Naturally, they select that Rattler, and it's removed from play. The hit from the trooper is assigned by Destro, and he selects one of the Serpents. Step 4, we clear away the Fallen. In Step 5, because there are no units in this battle that were offloaded from a cruiser, Destro gets to decide whether or not to press the attack or retreat. If he presses the attack, the Wolves would no longer have that first strike capability, but wouldn't have that -1 anymore either. So he could hit on a 3 or less and wouldn't have to worry about the wire-guided missiles from the Joe Snowcats. Still, after taking another look at the battle, he decides to retreat. He has to move all of the surviving units to a hex where at least one of the attacking units came from. In this case, they can all move back to the coast, or because the Wolf blitzed through the VP hex before moving into combat, they can move into that rather important VP hex. Does that make more sense now?
Definitely. Now, what is this that I'm hearing about air units and bomb diving?
Oh, I think you mean dive bombing.
Right, of course, dive bombing.
Right. Both types of air units have an ability called Divebomb, and I think this is the first time I've actually ever heard of this ability in the history of Axis and Allies. Here's how it works. During the combat move phase, any commander can make a combat move using any number of air units in range, and only air units, into a dual hex to attack C units specifically. Any hits scored by attacking air units are assigned first to C units, and then to air units in that hex. Land units in that hex will never receive hits during this kind of attack and are not allowed to return fire. Only sea and air units get to fire back. Then, in Step 5, all the surviving air units automatically retreat. Combat ends and the fighters will need to find a safe landing zone in the non-combat move phase. This can be a big deal, but there are some very important things to keep in mind. First, this ability is only good for one round of combat. After that first round, it is a mandatory retreat in Step 5. Dive bombing is only allowed in dual hexes, never in sea-only hexes. Dive bombing is not allowed if any land or sea units also attack that hex. It has to be air units only. Lastly, dive bombing is not a first strike effect. Any defending sea or air units get to return fire even if they've been hit or destroyed. So think of it this way. A Rattler or a group of Rattlers aiming at sea units are flying in and fast. So fast that the Joe's land units can't even get a shot off. And if Cobra is lucky, they can sink the USS Flag, fade one round of fire from the sea and air units in that hex and end the combat, and then find a safe place to land in the non-combat move phase.
Okay. What about that icebreaker thing?
Right. When the Cobra forces use the Weather Dominator to freeze a sea or dual hex, any commander can use a cruiser to remove it by attacking the hex. In the combat move phase, any commander can send one or more cruisers to attack an ice hex and attempt to break it in Kool-Aid Man style. However, the ice hex is still a land hex, so attacking cruisers kind of straddle the line between hexes until the success of that attack is determined. Note that the Icebreaker ability is only attacking the ice hex. Any units in that hex are not being fired at, and they don't get to fire at the incoming cruisers. In the conduct combat phase, all of the ice-breaking abilities and battles are rolled one at a time, but they're actually happening simultaneously. So the attacker can resolve the battles and the ice-breaking effects in any order that they choose. When resolving icebreaker attacks, the attacker will roll one die for each attacking cruiser at their normal attack value. If the attack fails, all the cruisers that attacked fail to enter the hex and are returned to the hex that they attempted to enter from, along with any cargo that they may have been carrying. Any units that were in the ice hex when the icebreaker attack failed are unaffected. Any successful hit by one or more of the attacking cruisers breaks the ice. Then all units, friendly and or enemy, in that now broken hex must immediately evacuate to an adjacent hex where they otherwise would be able to legally move. Basically, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. These evacuees don't all have to go to the same hex, but they all have to get out if they can. Units cannot evacuate to a hex if it's impassable to that unit type, if it would put that hex over the stacking limit, or if the hex is enemy controlled or occupied. A forced move into an unoccupied VP hex does not give that commander control. The attacker can choose to attack the units on an ice hex and the ice hex itself in the same combat move. Plus, the attacker gets to choose the order in which they are resolved. If they resolve the icebreaker first and it fails, the cruiser goes back to where it came from and the combat continues as normal. If the attack on the hex is successful, the ice hex will now have a mix of friendly and enemy units in it, and they all need to get out of there fast. The attacking units evacuate first, with the same options and restrictions that we just mentioned. Once the attacking units have evac'd, the enemy units will have to find a way out. If there are units belonging to more than one enemy commander, they move out in turn order after all of the attacking units are gone. Any units that can't find a legal move out of a broken ice hex are destroyed. On the upside, while attacking air units are forced out of the broken ice hex, they're just passing through that hex that they're forced into, so stacking limits don't apply. The forced move doesn't cost them a movement point, and they can move as normal during the non-combat move phase from that new hex. Defending air units get forced out and can move to an adjacent sea zone if a carrier of their color is there with enough space on their flight deck. Once all of the units have moved out of the now broken ice hex, remove the ice hex from the map. Now all of the cruisers that announced the attack on the previously frozen hex must now move into that newly passable hex. They bring their cargo with them and can't move any further this turn.
Sorry, Gary, we have some breaking news. Apparently, Alex Thorpe,
BGN's senior junior correspondent, has beaten me to the punch and has arranged interviews with the two G.I. Joe commanders leading the fight against Cobra Commander and Destro. Even though I've saved Admiral Keel, and Snowjob's bacon on more than one occasion, it seems they're standing by to talk to Alex. Well, we're very excited to welcome him to the show. Take it away from me, Alex.
Thanks, Victor.
Oh, never mind.
As urgent as this case is, let's hop right into our first guest. You may know him as the commander of the USS Flag, ace fighter pilot, logistics expert, and the best clarinet player in any naval force. Please welcome Admiral Keel.
Thanks, Alex. I'm glad to be talking to you instead of Geraldo Ramirez. All that guy seems to do is get kidnapped.
It's great to talk to you too. What can you tell us about what's happening in the Arctic Circle?
Well, Alex, Cobra Commander and Destro are stirring up trouble again with their weather Dominator. They are putting up a good fight, but with so much at stake, G.I. Joe will get the job done.
Because no one plans better than G.I. Joe. Right, Admiral?
That's right, Alex. In fact, and Cobra doesn't know this, our logistics are so good that during the deploy reinforcements step, I can deploy a Skystriker directly to a hex with a carrier and a land unit directly to a hex with a cruiser, wherever they might be, rather than only in a base hex. Of course, nothing is free, Alex. These units come from the mobilization zone and have to be purchased at the beginning of my turn. Plus, they can't be deployed to an overcrowded hex, and if they are deploying to a sea-only hex, my carriers and cruisers must also have space to stow the incoming units. Otherwise, our superior logistics can allow us to forward deploy some units directly to the front line every turn.
Wow, that could make a big difference. And now we know. And Admiral, can you hear me? Admiral. Okay, what's happening?
Ted can't help you now, Alex. I, Destro, have taken over the broadcast. Time for the truth to be told about these so-called heroes. G.I. Joe will be crushed under our boots, and the Weather Dominator Mark II will allow us to demand whatever we want from the nations of the world.
Destro, in what universe do you think you can defeat G.I. Joe? Did you just hear Admiral Keel? They've been planning for you.
I doubt they could have a plan for what I have in store. The stronger Joe's forces, the easier they will be for my units to destroy.
What do you mean?
That's classified. I have said too much already.
Well, if your plan is so great, why should it matter who knows?
You're right. Soon the Joes will be destroyed. Here goes. I have specifically trained my units in the best tactics for fighting larger groups of units. So, when they attack a hex that has 6 or more Joe units, all my units get a +1 to their attack power. This even works with my ski torpedoes, offsetting the one shortcoming of that incredibly powerful weapon.
Wow, Destro. That is impressive. I'm sure that the Joe's commanders aren't watching this and won't be looking out for that kind of attack. Thanks for telling us.
Wait, I will not allow some crazy wannabe.
Good job, Ted. Let's try to get this interview back on track. Let's welcome our next guest. Sergeant First Class Harlan Moore, better known as Snowjob.
Hey, Alex, that was really great intel you got from Destro. It's really going to help us because now we know, and...
Now you can be ready?
Yeah, something like that.
What can you share with us about what's happening up there?
Well, Alex, Cobra and Destro have their weather Dominator causing problems, and their units definitely mean business. What they don't know is that this is my home turf. My Arctic troopers love this stuff. In fact, I call them ski troopers because during the non-combat step of my turn, they can move up to 2 spaces instead of 1.
Wow, that's twice as fast as any other infantry unit. Can they also move 2 hexes during combat move?
No. If they're making a combat move, they gotta have their eye on the targets. So they can only move 1 hex during combat.
Still, that would allow your ski troopers to get into the action faster than... Oh no, not.
It is I,
Cobra Commander, taking over your broadcast to bring you this important truth. I'm bringing an end to all this tiresome rule of law and democracy. No more voting or shared governance. No more checks and balances on power. From now on, you will all answer to me. I will be the most powerful person in the world, and no one can stop me.
Excuse me, Mr. Commander.
You can call me Commander, or Cobra Commander.
Okay, Mr. Commander. Can you tell us how you plan to win this battle? The Joes have defeated your weather Dominator once, and they'll do it again.
The G.I. Joe forces are no match for mine. My forces are loyal to the very end.
What do you mean?
Every one of my forces are willing to win at all cost. This is top secret. Can I count on you not to tell anyone?
Sure. I promise that I won't tell anyone.
Good. Here it is. You won't believe it. At the end of the first round of combat, I can destroy any unit of mine in that combat to score a hit on a Joe unit. This works when I'm attacking or defending.
You're right. I don't believe it. You're telling me that you can blow up one of your units to make the Joes assign a hit to one of their units?
Yes! Diabolical, isn't it?
I guess. Can you just assign a free hit to one of your carriers to use this ability?
Well, unfortunately, no. The unit I sacrifice has to be removed from the battlefield.
I see. 2 questions. First, you get to decide which one of your units gets taken off the board, but the Joes get to decide which one of theirs takes the hit. Second, can you sacrifice any of Destro's units?
Alas! Destro units lack the same commitment as mine, so no, I can't destroy them. And yes, I pick which one of my units to destroy, but Joe gets to decide where to take the hit.
Thanks, Ted. I have one more question for you, Mr. Commander. Have you told your troops you have this ability? Do they know that they can be destroyed at any moment on your command?
Well, no, they...
I didn't think so. Nice talking with you. And as usual, thanks for monologuing all your plans.
You just wait a minute. Hold on. Oh.
Ted, you're the best. Do we still have... Yes? Okay, great. Please welcome back Admiral Keelhaul and Snowjob.
Great job, Alex. You got them to spill all of their special abilities.
Yeah, thanks for the intel. Now we can be ready for them.
Happy to help. Those guys do really love to talk. I guess it all worked out, because now we know, and knowing is half the battle. Thank you, gentlemen. Good luck in the battle. Now back to you in the studio, Hank.
Hector. My name is Hector. I'll forget it. Ted? When you're done laughing, can you get Gary back? I'm still here, Gerald. So, the Admiral can deploy a Skystriker anywhere he has a carrier with space, and a land unit anywhere he has a cruiser rather than just in his bases. He'll need to watch for his cargo and stacking limits in those hexes, but that's pretty cool. Snowjob's Arctic troops are actually ski troopers, and they can move 2 spaces during non-combat. That's also cool, but because land units can't move during combat and non-combat, he's going to have to choose which one he wants them to do. Should he attack or use their super speedy ability during non-combat? Cobra Commander's ability could be really powerful in the right situations. At the end of the very first round of combat, while attacking or on the defense, he can destroy one of his own units to force the enemy to select a hit. Basically, he can trade one of his units in the first round of combat for a guaranteed hit, but the opponent gets to select where that hit goes. That could be interesting in conjunction with the Divebombing ability. Destro's ability has the potential to be devastating in big battles. I mean, all of his units get +1 attack to all of their values in every round of combat that starts with 6 or more units on the defending hex. It even buffs the ski torpedo ability of the Wolves if that hex has 6 or more Joes on it. That is interesting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so if Keelhaul buys another carrier and then starts to head out towards the VP hexes. I need to talk to Doug. Oh, okay, Gary. You have fun with that. Bye-bye now. For our viewers out there, G.I. Joe needs your help. The heroes at Renegade Games have given us this game so that you can help us find the best way to stop Cobra from taking over the world. Visit the link in the description of this video to secure your copy today. Renegade is offering you this chance to play out this battle from both sides. So let us know in the comments the best way for Cobra to continue their conquest and the most effective way for the forces of G.I. Joe to defeat them. You can also drop any questions that you might have about the rules, and I will be happy to answer them. I wish Cobra Commander were here. I would give him a piece of my mind.
What did you say, Hector?
Wait, he knows my name? Thank you for watching. We hope you've enjoyed our guide to G.I. Joe Battle for the Arctic Circle. If you did, now's a great time to consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Thank you to our friends John Bosch, Robert Prather, Goose Maiden, Alex Thorpe, and the entire Thorpe family for joining in on the fun. Thank you to my lovely wife Jamie for sharing her dulcet tones for the voiceover piece. Thank you to Shannon Merritt for loaning us his Destro costume. And a big thank you to Matt Hyra, Terry Pollock, and Eric Beam for their help with the script. And of course, a big, giant, huge thank you to our friends at Renegade for making this great game, inviting us to help introduce it to the community, and for letting us have some fun with this video. And we did have a ton of fun making this video. We're working on a quick behind-the-scenes piece that's from this project, and when that's ready, it'll be right here. For more about this game, you'll find it over here. For our latest bit of mayhem, right this way. And if you're ready to join Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.